It's another episode of Viral Weather on the Weather Network. We want to talk about COVID-19, its impact on your weather forecast and on how we track storms. So we have our Chief Meteorologist, Chris Scott, our Editorial Manager of Weather Operations here at the Weather Network, DAYNA VETTESE, and GERALD CHENG joins us. He's a warning preparedness meteorologist at Environment Canada. So Chris, we heard the story about less flights in the air, less data from the upper atmosphere, right?
Yeah, this story came out in March, and it's from the European Center for Weather Forecasting. At the Weather Network, we actually bring this excellent computer model in to our machine that basically assembles the best of all weather forecasts before our meteorologists get at that and make an even better forecast. So this European Center came out with a statement saying the reduced air travel was having an effect on the quality of the output of their computer forecast. And to understand why, you kind of have to step back and look at how we make a weather forecast. Doing a weather forecast is like trying to solve a 3D puzzle that's constantly moving around the world. So when you think of a 3D puzzle, you think, okay, I've got to know all the shapes, their colors, exactly where they fit. And to do that, we take observations to figure out what's going on at each of these points around the world that create this puzzle. Aircraft are a key ingredient to that because onboard aircraft are sensors. They're sensors that obviously indicate the speed, the altitude, but also the temperature and the wind and the humidity. So when COVID hit and the lockdown happened in many parts of Europe, the number of flights were reduced by about 50%. And the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, which produces these really great computer models that we use, said, wow, this is having an impact. Now, it wasn't a huge impact, but it was reducing the accuracy of especially the wind forecasts that are important for planes up at around 10 kilometers. Also, though, there were a few little impacts on what we see where we live at the ground in terms of the weather. So, GERALD, my question to you is at Environment Climate Change Canada, have you seen any negative impact from the lack of these aircraft observations on your computer models?
Well, those are very staggering statistics because there has been a great reduction in terms of the number of flights. And Europe does have a cause of concern because their reduction is about 70%. So that's a significant reduction compared to normal times. In particular, though, North America, what is interesting is that we still have enough flights to provide a 3D picture over North America. The reduction is only 40% if you're only looking at flights in this continent. So for us, we still get a good picture from flight sensors of what the atmosphere is. And of course, our European partners, they are trying to have mitigative approaches, such as, for example, launching weather balloons more often. Instead of twice a day, which is the norm, they are launching them 4 times a day in certain sites. And of course, there are other sources, such as satellites, satellite-derived winds, to help them to make up these losses.
That was a great key to satellite in that, you know, we think about weather stations. Oftentimes when people ask me, well, how do you guys forecast the weather? You must need a weather station. Well, they're important, but they're just one element of the mix that brings in all the data that allows us to see this 3D puzzle. Satellites represent 90% of the data that feeds these models that underlie our weather forecast. So if those went down, we'd be in big trouble. But I think you put it perfectly, GERALD. There's enough other things out there that give us, I think, some hope that we're not going to see any major problems if there were even more reductions.
And DAYNA, when it comes to us creating our forecasts here at the Weather Network, has there been like any hiccup that way at all?
Not with regards to the data. Obviously, there were some concerns with the study that had come out of Europe about that data, but similar to what GERALD has said, we haven't seen too much of an impact. Now, we've had an impact to our operations and making sure our staff are staying safe and ensuring that they're working in the safest environment to get those forecasts out there. And I'm sure it's the same thing at Environment Canada as well. But otherwise, we haven't seen too much of an issue with regards to actually getting those forecasts published and getting them out to the public.
GERALD, has it been problematic in Environment Canada with people working remotely from home, or is there, I mean, because there's a great conversation that takes place and face-to-face conversations are always best.
Absolutely. Well, so there's no more group huddles, certainly, but there are platforms to help us, such as this one that we are on. We could be having video conferencing as a tool to maintain that communication amongst team members while respecting physical distancing measures. As well, we could, through these platforms, share our screens so that we can point out on the radar, hey, this is the thunderstorm that we are looking at. What do you think? And so that will, the discussions between team members in the weather office is still happening.
So our conversation left off with the start of thunderstorm and really severe weather season here in Canada, spring and into the summer months. And thunderstorms pop up fast. We can call them sometimes several days in advance, but sometimes they just happen, don't they, Chris?
We love it as meteorologists because I think we all love the mystery where we know a lot of the picture, but there's an element of surprise that's going to pop up. And as we've been looking ahead to this season, we've got a lot we're doing at the Weather Network to make sure that we're able to cover those situations and give you critical updates. But I was curious, Gerald, at Environment and Climate Change Canada, if you're doing anything different in terms of issuing tornado warnings. And I'm thinking especially because, you know, that's the ultimate in collaboration a lot of the time where you need multiple heads looking at something. You think about the province of Ontario, it's vast. You've got a couple people trying to follow a cold front and all of these storms going on. How are you looking forward to that and the challenges of trying to issue these life-saving warnings while you're implementing physical distancing?
Well, in the office, especially in the operational area where the severe weather meteorologists sit, we have limited the number of people who can go into that area. So there are sign-in sheets. We have to track who's going in, who's coming out. If there are IT issues as well, so that we can track and trace. So ensuring the safety and health of our severe weather meteorologists is key. But certainly we have set up other areas as well so that people can go on to other computers in other areas of the building so that they could also issue timely warnings. So now it comes down to the communication because there's no more face-to-face communication. But there are many platforms out there that allow us to communicate virtually and share our screens so that we can discuss storms, we can discuss the situation of the day to maintain that communication.
I'm curious too, Gerald, this is something that happens even without COVID, but can you describe what happens, let's say in Toronto, if there's a major IT issue or a power failure, something unexpected happens, you've got backups right across the country. So if Toronto goes down, is it Winnipeg that jumps in and how does that work?
Well, it's certainly an extraordinary time right now because we are already dealing with one emergency. So how would we do if we have another emergency such as a power failure? And in fact, we had one last week in Montreal, and the Montreal weather office threw responsibility to the Toronto office. So we called people in while maintaining social distancing in the office. So they were sitting in another area separately, maintaining communication through these platforms, sending out forecasts on behalf of the Montreal weather office. So in fact, that was a good exercise to see, hey, would it work? Do we have a good business continuity plan in place to make sure that we can deliver essential services to Canadians?
I know that Environment Canada has been really busy upgrading all of their radar facilities across the country. Has COVID-19 had an impact on the schedule of that?
Well, back in February, I was asking about the schedule of the radar renewal project, and somebody was telling me, oh, China is still in lockdown, and the parts are coming from China. Oh, interesting. So particularly the radome and the antenna are coming from China. So there was already delays there. They have opened up. But now we are in a sort of lockdown in various parts of the country, and we're starting to open. So some parts of the construction has already been done last year and early this year. So it really depends on the specific schedule of that particular radar.
DAYNA, here at the Weather Network, we launched Storm Center, which is an app for your phone so that you can track storms in real time with our team of meteorologists here. How is COVID-19 going to have an impact on that for us as we get into this really busy, active season in the summer?
Well, what we're doing is basically trying to set up a virtual newsroom. So similar to what Gerald mentioned, we do have a limited number of people that are allowed in the office, and they each have their own areas. Similarly, we have sign-in sheets. We only have certain people that are allowed in certain areas. This is to ensure that we can get that important life-saving information to the public, whether it's a tornado warning or we're concerned about flash floods, or even if it's a forecast for the next day. But what we've done is we've set up a lot of virtual newsrooms for those members of our teams who are working from home. So we basically have an open channel where we're able to communicate with one another when a warning does get issued from Environment Canada. So if a tornado warning comes through, we can communicate that to the rest of our team. We've basically set people up at home to be able to broadcast from home and from in the studio, just to ensure that we're all communicating. But the biggest challenge is going to be that communication piece, because a newsroom is collaborative, just like Gerald mentioned. That collaboration between forecasters is super important when it comes to severe weather. So that is our biggest hurdle to overcome. But so far we've been able to do it. It is a little challenging to make sure we don't talk over one another and conferencing with videos, but so far so good. But we have had to do a lot of little technological feats just to overcome some of the barriers that were there in order to maintain physical distancing.
Gerald's people at Environment, I mean, we've read their forecast, we've looked at it, we've taken all the models together. It's going to be a stormy day. How do we put a plan in motion here during COVID-19 at the Weather Network?
Well, there's a few things we really have to keep in mind, and one of that is our field teams. We normally send a field team out to cover the active weather. We go out in the worst weather, so you don't have to, and you can watch us from the comfort of your home, whether it's on your phone or on your television or on your computer. And so that's something we've really had to address, because we don't want to be sending one of our reporters out to an area where they could be exposing themselves to COVID-19, or they could be exposing others to COVID-19. We don't want a situation where they have to stay in a hotel or be in and out of gas stations and restaurants in order to get food. So we've had to keep them close to home. So it does actually introduce a little bit of a challenge in broadcasting the severe weather to people at home, where we've had to kind of limit how far our teams are traveling in order to keep them safe and to keep those communities safe.
A big part of that too, Chris, is that what DAYNA's team does is it's not just in the field, of course, but it's that coverage and it's that collating of all of your information that comes into us. So it's maybe going to be even more important this spring and summer. It seems like it's far away, but like we're going to have a tornado very soon somewhere in Canada. It's going to happen. We need your photos, your videos, showing us what's going on, and then DAYNA's team can show everyone and get the message out there.
DAYNA, because we've been, we're deep into this whole COVID now, and because you're the manager of all the video content that comes into the Weather Network, have you seen an increase in Canadians' involvement in their willingness and want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been fantastic. I think a lot of people have a little bit more time on their hands. Everyone's situation is different depending on your family situation and your work situation. But a lot of people generally have been online a lot more often. So we're actually seeing a lot more engagement from the public with us on our platforms, whether it's just sharing a hilarious video of their dog doing something in the backyard, or it's a beautiful video of a rainbow, or it's a thunderstorm. We've seen a lot more of that community involvement, and that's really key to us being able to communicate that message. Even if it's just something fun that we can put into people's homes to make them feel a little bit of joy in this stressful situation, that's one thing. But being able to see these severe weather reports from different parts of the country that we can't reach right now physically is super helpful for us to be able to communicate to other people in your community that this could be happening or this report coming in. So we certainly have been seeing a lot more of that lately, which has been absolutely wonderful for us here to be able to communicate.
And Gerald, I know at Environment Canada, you have your official weather observers, but you have a team across the country of volunteer weather observers. Have they been, I guess, more active in communicating with you over this COVID period?
Well, this is really the era of social media, and we still get a lot of weather reports on social media, pictures, videos. Those are key to allow us to know what's going on. And there are also webcams as well. And of course, you've mentioned the volunteer observers. They still call in from time to time to report weather. So we have numerous sources to get weather information to allow us to forecast.
It's been an interesting time, and it's nice, Chris and Gerald and Dana, that we have this relationship with Environment Canada that is one that works together to make sure Canadians get the best possible weather information on any single platform when they absolutely need it. And of course, we'll continue to do that as we work through the busy months of the summer and thunderstorms and all of the weather associated with that. We thank Gerald CHENG from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Our Chief Meteorologist, Chris Scott, is here. So is our Editorial Manager of Weather Operations, DAYNA VETTESE. And now we're joined by Jason PERSOFF. He's a physician at the University College Hospital of Colorado, and he's a storm chaser. Welcome to our panel. We want to talk about April was the deadliest month for tornadoes in the U.S. since 2011. There were more recorded tornadoes. I mean, Jason, how's it been with COVID-19 and people out tracking these storms?
Man, I'll tell you, it's a mixed bag. This is a really complicated issue, right? During April in the United States, there were a lot of stay-at-home orders, which basically mandated people stay at home. And even though recreational travel was allowed for things like going out and jogging or sitting by a park, it really wasn't meant for storm chasers to be out storm chasing in these communities. One of the biggest concerns we had as physicians is that storm chasers could be out there actually spreading disease to small towns, causing a huge spike in those numbers. So April was a bad month to be out storm chasing. A lot of people gave peer pressure to those who were chasing, saying you shouldn't be out there. And I agreed with that because stay at home actually does mean stay at home. So it really changed the dynamic, and it affected a number of different chasers, including myself.
What percentage of chasers, I mean, every year, about how many are actually out doing this in the U.S.?
Oh, God. Well, that number has definitely skyrocketed. I would assume thousands now. A lot of that because of the ease of popping open your phone and getting real-time weather data. It's a really remarkable thing back from when I was doing it, where we used cuneiform tablets and tried to look at the stars to make sure that the next day there'd be storms. So there are thousands of people who do this every spring, and we know that to be true based on our own subjective experiences too. This year, fortunately, the numbers are down because a lot of people are really trying to heed this message that COVID is deadly.
Well, I mean, Dana, you didn't go this year, you and Brad, your husband. It was because of COVID, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a lot of international travelers that come to the United States every spring to storm chase. People from Australia, people from Italy, people from all across Europe and the UK come from all over the world to chase tornadoes in Tornado Alley. And you can't travel right now. Even if I wanted to go storm chasing and I decided to disobey some of the orders, I can't get across the border. I'm not allowed to cross the border. I don't have a good enough reason to do it. So that's one of the reasons, aside from also just being responsible and knowing that I could either spread the disease to other places in the United States, or I could contract the disease and bring it back home with me. Those were some of the reasons that caused us to not be out chasing this spring, and was the decision for a lot of people. I know a lot of chase tour companies have also canceled or deferred their tours until next year as well. So there's a big business that's involved in storm chasing. It's not just recreation. And so when we talk about businesses being affected by COVID, the storm chasing business has absolutely been impacted as well.
It's an interesting one too, because I think storm chasing is just a microcosm of so many other things where people are trying to decide, do I or don't I? And it ranges from someone has a property like a cottage or a home, and they want to go to it. They actually own it, but then I should stay at home. I'm wondering, Jason, if you're seeing a shift now in that, epidemiology, maybe you can speak to a little bit of what you're seeing in Colorado and in general across the southern and central plains. Are people starting to get stir crazy, and I assume that includes storm chasers, and are willing to kind of maybe start to push out and break the rules and say, yeah, I can be self-sufficient, I can do it, I'm not going to put anyone else in danger?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's absolutely one of the biggest problems we're facing right now. The reality is, if you look at the United States, Tornado Alley, which most of us know goes from Texas all the way up into Montana and up into the Canadian plains as we move further into the season, that area is actually right now experiencing exponential growth of COVID cases. In a lot of these rural towns, western Kansas, Nebraska actually has more cases right now of COVID than New York City does. So when you talk about those areas being affected, that's what we're looking at. But of course, people are going stir crazy. Now, it's been very helpful that you guys have allowed Arctic air to travel down into the United States and currently shut down a lot of the chasing possibilities for the moment. However, we know that in all likelihood, based on the long-term modeling and spaghetti noodles that we look at the forecasting, it looks like the latter half of May is going to be very active. So the question then becomes, what is my personal responsibility? And the problem with COVID is so many people can spread this disease because they don't get symptoms. People who do get symptoms obviously are out, but for most people, they're asymptomatic. They go about and they are the highest risk people. So going into these little small towns and things like this, they could literally decimate some of these small towns that have only a few people who live there, and most of them are older. It could be absolutely unparalleled in its destruction.
Okay, so I mean, COVID has been a problem, and people are generally being responsible about it. And so this is the story of what you all do every day this time of year when the storms are brewing. So how does a day go? How does it start? What time does it start? When? What?
My goodness. Yeah, what, when? Oh, all these questions. But the reality is it starts probably the day or several days before. The day before is really the key day because we want to really try and get ourselves into position. Storm chasing is a lot of driving, and the closer we are to our target area, the better. So we actually do a lot of forecasting the afternoon before to position ourselves in the right location. Then in the next morning, we get up and we start really continue to massage the maps and try and find out from the weather gods where we think the most likely places to be. Keep in mind, really you need to be within 25 miles of where your target is when the storms form, because you can't really shuffle between storms very easily. So we try to get there early on. We sit there and then we wait. The worst part is the waiting, especially with DAYNA. She doesn't tolerate that very well. It can be very difficult. And then when the storms are on, it's game on.
So, you know, the computer models come out at the end of the day and the beginning of the day. So when you finish late at night, some town, you look at the data from the end of the day. But I mean, really, then you just have to go to bed and wait till the next morning and see what those models say, right? And there's a difference between the morning models and the end of day models.
Well, and you also are factoring in satellite and radar data and dew points and real-time MEDAR data. So it's actually really complex.
Well, what do you look for, DAYNA?
Well, we have to look, as Jason mentioned, several days in advance, because if you've got a target in Texas in 2 days, but you've got a target the next day in South Dakota, it's going to be really difficult to make that drive and get to those storms on time. So you kind of have to decide between certain events sometimes, and you'll have to pass on one event in favor of another that you think might produce better storms for you to watch, photograph, and video. But we look for a lot of things. We look to make sure that these storms are going to produce. They're going to be relatively isolated so that you can see them, low precipitation. If they do form a tornado, you can actually see it, and it's not buried in the rain, and that they're actually going to be tornadic rather than a run-of-the-mill thunderstorm that might just produce a lot of hail or a lot of rain. There's a lot of things that go into it, and there's a high probability of busting and getting that forecast wrong. So that's a tough pill to swallow that we will have to from time to time.
I'm curious too. I mean, I'm not a huge storm chaser. I'd like to do more, but I don't do as much as you guys. Jason, how did you get interested in it? And was weather your first passion and medicine your second? And I'm just curious about your journey and how you become this really respected storm chaser.
Yeah, I don't know how I got to be respected, but I can answer the rest of the questions. The rest of the question is basically when I was a kid, I happened to live on the edge of a geographic location called the DCVZ, the Denver Convergence Vorticity Zone, which happens to be a natural area for land spouts, tornadoes that are formed quite a little bit differently than supercell tornadoes. And so we would get these hotbeds of tornadoes every spring, and I look forward to that every year, usually around June. When I was young, I really had a passion for photography, but severe weather really got me rocking. And I remember I'd always get excited when storms were coming and sad when they left. In college, I read that people chased storms, and it was like an aha moment. Oh, you mean I don't have to just wait for the next storm to come some other day? I can actually follow the storms. And from there, it was just off to the races of learning meteorology. The difference, the reason I like medicine so much is because it's a complex problem I can solve, whereas meteorology is very, very tricky, and sometimes it's not that easy. So it's kind of interesting.
There seem to be some parallels there, though, because there's a lot of pattern recognition. I mean, I'm sure in medicine you're stitching together experience and you're making some synthesis for a prediction, and same thing in weather, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's an intense overlap between medicine and storm chasing. There's an anatomy and a physiology to storms, and it's one of the reasons that I can truly understand when I'm looking at a storm what I believe is actually happening there. And there's also this incredible piece that comes from being able to synthesize the two forms of thought that I have. It's just, there's nothing like it.
I want to ask you a question, because you said, when you're placing yourself in position, you want the optimal type of storm. What do you mean by that?
So I think Dana hit it right. When we talk about tornadic storms, we're not talking about necessarily storms that produce tornadoes. We're really talking about incredible supercell thunderstorms that offer this incredible structure. I mean, it's hard to imagine that water vapor that is 3 times higher than the height of Mount Everest is creating sculptures in the air with lightning and structure and occasionally tornadoes in a backdrop of country landscape. I mean, come on, this is just, what more do you need, man? That's just magic.
Well, if you're watching this, I mean, you're seeing some of the imagery as we're having this discussion. Chris Scott, Chief Meteorologist at the Weather Network. You've gone chasing. I never have. So we're kind of, I guess, newbies at this business. But it's interesting.
It's really neat stuff. I've done it enough to know that I can be dangerous, but I'm certainly not experienced like Jason and Dana are with the big storms that we get in the plains of the U.S. and in parts of the prairies. But I was curious, Dana, what does the 15 minutes before things really erupt look like, or once a cell has started to form and you think, this may be it? Because I think there's maybe a misconception there that every storm that pops up produces a tornado. But on a given day, it's a rare thing to get. So what does that look like? And what's going through your mind? And what are you physically doing?
It's probably the most frustrating and exciting 15 minutes, if I could put it that way, because there's no guarantees. There's never a guarantee. There have been days where 15 minutes up to when you would think a tornado would form, you've got this beautiful supercell. That's the only way to put it. I say beautiful. Yes, I know they're dangerous. Yes, they cause damage. But to look at them, they're absolutely beautiful. And then you see that wall cloud form. And that's the area where the tornado would form out of if it's going to. And you see this wall cloud form, and then it starts rotating. And then you start to notice these tendrils rotating. And then sometimes, if you're lucky, you get that tornado and the conditions are just right and it plants a tornado for you. But more often than not, it doesn't. And it just dissipates, and then the storm dissipates, and you're left wondering, why did that happen? And so that's the mystery of tornado forecasting and chasing tornadoes, is we still don't know why some storms produce a tornado and why some storms don't. But that 15 minutes leading up to that tornado on the ground is super exciting. Your adrenaline's going. You're also kind of nervous. You're second guessing every decision that you're making, which is why it's great to chase in a group, like when we chase with Jason and some of our other colleagues at the Weather Network, is we can bounce these ideas off each other and keep ourselves level, because you're second guessing every decision that you're making.
And I'm ashamed to say I've never seen a tornado, and it's a bucket list item. I've got to do it someday. I've probably watched at least hundreds of videos. I've probably had hundreds of dreams about them. But Jason, the thing that when I've seen the videos that just is so remarkable is that we think of weather a lot of the times on the time scale of hours, maybe minutes when it comes to thunderstorms, but tornadoes are changing by the second. That's Tell me what that's like, how quickly can one form and then dissipate?
Well, we know that the average length of a tornado is 7 minutes. So one of the challenges in chasing is you have to be in a place where you can see that, because if you're waiting until there's a tornado warning, you're probably too late. One of the things Dana didn't mention, by the way, is the frustration that that's probably not the only storm of the day going on while we're chasing. We've committed. Just like you commit to the line in the grocery store that you think is going to be the fastest, we do the same thing, and it can be very frustrating to see that suddenly the storms around you that you gave up on put out tornadoes. But yes, tornadoes happen very, very rapidly, and what you see when you're there is the tornado can touch down very temporarily. It's rare to see one that lasts more than 15 minutes at all anyway, except on some really amazing days. For example, on May 24th, 2016, I saw 13 tornadoes from a cluster of supercells. That was amazing, but I have gone years without seeing tornadoes. They are that evanescent, which is why I also like the storm structure, because at least that's my also ran present.
What for each of you who have been out on the plains, what has been the most moving thing that you've seen?
Well, I think there's a couple things. They're probably the higher end events that really leave an emotional impact on you. I know Jason's got some, but off the top of my head would have to be the May 31st, 2013 El Reno tornado, where we lost some chase colleagues. People lost their lives, widest tornado on record. That day we were in a very dangerous situation, and to the best of our ability, we got out of the situation, but circumstances aligned that it posed a very dangerous situation for us. And I think that was probably the most impactful day, because it really did put into perspective that you're, as much as you think you're in control, nature's in control, and you can try to adjust for every single and plan for every single little thing that could change or go wrong, but you're not going to be able to do that for every single scenario. And so that day really proved that. And I think it made a lot of us really check our priorities and our thoughts going into a chase day.
I was out there for Joplin when Joplin was destroyed on May 21st, 2011, I think. And that was, I volunteered at the hospital there after that happened, and to see the people of Joplin having had a town 2 hours before and then no town after 10 minutes of a tornado passing through their town. I've never seen anything like that.
So it's not ethical with COVID-19 to be out mingling and potentially spreading COVID around. But as far as storm chasing goes, is it, I mean, with the number of people who are doing it, I mean, some people who think they can read a radar on their phone think that they know exactly everything about meteorology. It's not true, is it?
No, it's definitely not true. And I know DAYNA can speak to this too. The reality is, even after decades of experience, I can still misinterpret the radar images. I can still forget to check the timestamp to make sure that the radar image I'm looking at is within the past 5 minutes. Sometimes we have cell towers knocked out from severe weather, and my radar may not be updating, and yet I'm making decisions based on the radar that's there. The other big problem is there's such an incredible crush for people to try to get on these storms so that they can have huge impacts on social media, that it actually has led to huge traffic jams occurring, and we've been stuck. I know DAYNA and I have been stuck in traffic. There's only so many roads that people can go on, and the reality is that if all of us are on those same roads, then we run into problems.
Well, and DAYNA, I know you've said when you've come back, I think it was one of the last times you came back from the Tornado Alley, and you said, I'm not doing it again, not going there again. It was because of the traffic. And now I've just observed, though, that, a year goes by and then you'll go, well, I think I can pull it off. Where's your head at? I mean, I know you want to go when there's not a COVID-related kind of push to not go, but where's your head at in terms of chasing and the ethics of that?
Yeah, it's certainly something that plays into the decision now, COVID aside, because obviously we won't be traveling due to COVID-19. But outside of that, it really is a thing that plays into our decision to go every year. There's a lot of people doing it, and the increased risk of car accidents, as Jason mentioned in an earlier segment, that we are seeing so many more car accidents now than ever before. We had a day in the last year where we were on this only road in Colorado, and we saw probably about, I think, 6 accidents, and each of those accidents was serious enough to have emergency officials there. And we're taking those emergency officials away from people in those towns who might need them because of the storm. So it is a huge thing for us to weigh when we're deciding, is it ethically okay for us to be doing this? But it's also a hobby that I love, and you can apply that same sentiment to a lot of people's hobbies. And so you really have to weigh that in your mind and try the best you can to drive as responsibly as possible, though we know accidents do happen. As Jason mentioned, hydroplaning is a real risk, and we know we can overwhelm the roads there. And so we try our best to not do that, but we are having an impact on those towns, whether it's from a supply chain or emergency officials, or just overwhelming their roads when they're just trying to get to work. So it really is something that we weigh, and it's something that I don't want to be a hypocrite about, because I do go out chasing, and it is something that weighs on my mind and my colleagues when we do go out every year.
So, but let's go now to all of the positive that is done by people who do this. I mean, there are teams that go out from universities, and you're all doing research and gleaning great information.
Well, one of the things to keep in mind is that and a lot of people forget this, the Earth is a sphere. In fact, there's a whole bunch of people who don't believe that, but the Earth is a sphere, and radar can only see things in straight lines. So as that line of radar goes further and further away to measure storms that aren't close to the radar, you end up running into problems of not being able to see the bottom of the storms on those radar, and that's where storm spotting and chasing is absolutely critical. And as DAYNA had mentioned earlier, we know the fact is that we still don't understand what causes one storm to form a tornado and another storm not to. And so these university teams are very important. We know that storm chasing has actually caused harm to those research attempts, in part because they can't get placed where they need to go. But I want to riff really briefly on what DAYNA said about taking emergency services. In this era of COVID, many local hospitals are already overwhelmed dealing with COVID. And so getting into a fender bender that ends up causing you to go into the hospital actually takes substantial resources right now in the middle of a pandemic.
Jason, there's been a discussion with COVID about potentially having immunity certificates. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where you'll have to have a storm chasing certificate?
God, we hear this every year, believe it or not. I cringe at both thoughts. First, on the COVID thing, only about 2/3 of people actually make antibodies to COVID, so it doesn't really make sense that you'd be immune. And then the second, on the storm chasing thing, who's going to police the people who are storm chasing? I just don't think that there's a viability there. Notwithstanding, I don't want to deprive somebody of being inspired by science.
DAYNA?
Yeah, I would agree. Again, I don't want to be a hypocrite about it, because I love it. I love being out there, and there is viable and valuable information that's provided not just only by storm chasers, but these research teams that are out there.
Okay, terrific. What a great team we've had today. And incidentally, this is available as a podcast if you're not listening to it. GERALD CHENG joined us from Environment Canada initially, also DAYNA VETTESE, who is our manager of editorial and weather operations and a storm chaser here at the Weather Network, our chief meteorologist, Chris Scott, and Dr. Jason PERSOFF, who's a storm chaser, but also a physician in Colorado. We appreciate all of you being here. Wherever you download podcasts, you can get the full podcast of this episode and all the other viral weather episodes that we have recorded.